Members, the time for this debate has expired. I call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 1 to 4.
Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Bill, Gambling Amendment Bill number 3, Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill, Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Legislation Bill, committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Bill and the Gambling Amendment Bill number 3, for further consideration of the Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill, for consideration of the Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Legislation Bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker. The House and Committee for consideration of the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Bill and the Gambling Amendment Bill number 3, for further consideration of the Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill and for consideration of the Organised Crime and Anti-Corruption Bill. Members, we turn first to the Taxation, Land Information Offshore Persons Information Bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part.
Mr. Chair.
Grant Roberts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to take a call in the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Bill under Part 1. I mainly want to focus in this first call on this part around the question of definitions of the main home. But before I do come to that, it is important to note that the purpose of this bill, the huge government initiative that lay behind this bill was to respond to public concern about the lack of information about who was buying and selling homes in our country. And I have to say, ultimately, when we look at Part 1 of this bill, which amends the Land Transfer Act, it is a seriously underwhelming piece of legislation in terms of achieving the goals that the government has set for itself in trying to address this issue of the lack of information. The shorthand, Mr. Chair, for this bill is, for people has been, it's the Foreign Buyers Register Bill. That's the thing that people say when you talk about this piece of legislation in the communities and cafes and halls of New Zealand, as they no doubt will be discussing this bill. It fails utterly to live up to that anecdotal name. There are so many loopholes. There is such lack of clarity about the definitions within the bill, and ultimately, I believe, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that we will be back before very long, possibly under a new government, changing all of this because we failed to do the rhetorical thing that the government said they would do, which is actually create that register, give New Zealanders the confidence and the information to know who it is purchasing homes, get past the anecdotal issues about who it is, and actually get down to the nitty-gritty of making policy based on evidence about how we can ensure New Zealanders can live the Kiwi dream of being able to buy their own home. New Zealanders of long standing or New Zealanders who have recently arrived, whoever they are, that ideal of being able to buy their own home is being compromised at the moment in our view. This piece of legislation could have been the vehicle by which we gave New Zealanders that confidence and that information, but unfortunately, Mr. Chair, it fails on many counts. The first of those counts that I want to come to is the definition of main home, which is contained in section 4 of the bill, the redrafted section 156A of the Land Transfer Act. The Select Committee has made some changes, Mr. Chair, to the definition of main home. It did this in part in response to submissions raised by a number of people. I think particularly the New Zealand Law Society submission was influential on members of the committee in terms of where the definition should go. It would be fair to say, Mr. Chair, we're in uncharted territory here. This is not a definition that we all will find, apart from the bill that we passed yesterday, that you will find anywhere else in New Zealand law. And that was of concern to the Select Committee. And I think it's worth noting, that the changes that have been made in the definition of main home drew the attention of the Select Committee. And there is a minority report from the Labor Party and the Green Party as well. But actually, even the government's own members in their responses in the report noted just how difficult and interesting this definition would be. And I just want to quote briefly from there just the final sentence of the report of the committee. So this is National Party members of the committee. We recognise that there could be some confusion about these rules and have been assured that guidance material would be provided for buyers and sellers and conveyancers, in addition to more detailed explanatory material provided in IRD's tax information bulletins. So that's as good as it gets from the government trying to create a register of foreign borrowers. They put in place an exemption for the main home, and I'll come back to why I'm concerned about that exemption. They put in place an exemption for the main home, and their own members in the Select Committee report say, we recognise that there could be some confusion about these rules. Why on earth, Mr Chair, are they bringing to this Parliament law that they're confused about? That's not what we're here to do. We're here to create clear lines for people to follow. This is an area where we want accurate information. And the problem here, Mr Chair, is that the definition of main home is the creation of an exemption, Mr Chair,
Grant Robertson.
Is the creation of an exemption within this law, which effectively can turn into a loophole. So, Mr Chair, the confusion, as it's been stated for us by members of the government members of the Select Committee, comes in this part of the bill. So the definition of main home within the bill, Mr Chair, just to find my place again, the definition of main home has been changed. One of the key elements that was removed after the Law Society's intervention was a reference within the definition to members of a person's family. So the original definition of main home was, for a person, the one home that is mainly used as a residence by the person and any member of the person's family living with the person. And so the Law Society, among others, came to the Select Committee and said, well, that's going to cause some trouble, isn't it? If potentially, and members of Parliament will be very familiar with this scenario, potentially if somebody spends a lot of time away from their home, but their family stay in the home, which is the main family home. If an MP, as an example, were to own a home in Wellington and a home in Dunedin, as Dr Clark does, which would be the main home, depending how much time they spent there. If an MP does, as many MPs in this House have done, comes from far away from Wellington, moves their family to Wellington in order for children, for instance, to go to school, but they keep the home in their home electorate, which most wise MPs would do if they want to be re-elected, which was the main home. So that confusion, that's just an example from MPs, but you could take that to a lot of other jobs that require people to be in two cities or more than one city at a time. So the Select Committee looked at that and quite rightly decided to deal with that issue by removing the reference to a person's family living with them. So the new definition of main home is main home means for a person the one dwelling rather than home, we'll return to that issue in a moment, that is mainly used as a residence by the person, a home, and with which the person has the greatest connection if they have more than one home. And this is the nub of the problem with this clause. The phrase greatest connection is an invention. It's an invention of this piece of legislation. It's got no case law that lies behind it. It hasn't been tested. And I venture to suggest, Mr Chair, it will be interpreted wildly differently by different people as they go through this process. Again, what we're trying to establish here is a register that can let New Zealanders know who is buying and selling houses in our country. And by creating an exemption for the main home in that register, the government opens a loophole. Then in the definition of the main home, they create a further loophole by putting in place a definition that says the place with which the person, or the dwelling with which the person has the greatest connection. And Mr Chair, I'd venture to suggest that this is going to be a significant problem. And I would ask perhaps the Minister and the Chair, and I feel a bit reluctant to ask the Minister to take a call or get to her feet, but I would ask government members or the Minister to actually help explain to Parliament and to New Zealanders why they need to exempt the main home at all. And my colleague Julianne Genter has a supplementary order paper to in fact delete the main home definition, because this is not about the question of who a tax applies to or anything like that. That's a different piece of legislation we've dealt with. This is simply about creating a register. There's no great encumbrance upon people having to register the fact that they have a main home. I'd say 99% of the people who have a main home in New Zealand will already have an IRD number and already have a bank account, which are the two tests that come in Part 2 of the bill in terms of being on the register. So there's no great compliance issue, and in fact all we're doing is creating a gap in the information that we're trying to create, the information database we're trying to create. So, Mr. Chair, from our point of view, and we say this in our minority report, there is no reason to create the main home exemption. And in fact, by creating such a loose definition within main home, we have a significant problem. So, Mr. Chair, when we look at the question of greatest connection, this does offer an element of subjectivity, which is the reason why government members of the committee have described the potential for confusion in what happens, because you know, officials, and I do need to say this, that the officials who came to the committee did say to us, it won't be subjective, it will be an objective test. I simply don't believe that.
Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Louise Upston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.